Go ahead and call this hearing to order. Good morning and welcome to all that are here. We're here today to talk about what I view as a fundamental breakdown in America's budget process. And it is a breakdown that has significant ramifications for not only government but for our nation. I mentioned a lot last year that we had 260 expired authorizations that we were still spending money on to the tune of $293.5 billion. I evidently mentioned it enough that we changed that from 260 down to 256, but we increased the spending from $293 billion to $310 billion. We need to be going back and looking at things and making sure that we know what we're spending our money on. It's essential to start with the premise of good government that we should authorize programs and activities before it funds them. And as the former chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, I strongly value the process by which programs are authorized and reauthorized. When Congress utilizes an authorization, it's creating a federal solution to a perceived need. But over time, needs change. Program flaws become apparent. Technology evolves, and over time, inevitably, Congress creates more programs, many of which are duplicative of existing programs, as the Comptroller General of the General Accountability Office testified before this committee last year. Congress must re-examine what we are actually funding in order to improve or eliminate government programs not delivering results. By taking a closer look at these programs and activities, we'd have more funding flexibility to boost important programs and priorities. This is also probably the best way to avoid creating new programs that duplicate those already being funded. In short, there are a slew of reasons why Congress needs to periodically review and reauthorize the very federal programs and activities it initiates. But the problem is, we're not doing it. Most of the big-ticket federal entitlement programs like Medicare and Medicaid have permanent authorizations. Not surprisingly, they have proven to be particularly difficult to reform. On the discretionary side, defense authorization is reauthorized annually, like clockwork, via the National Defense Authorization Act. But the majority of non-defense discretionary spending is now unauthorized. We have a chart showing the last year $310 billion of the roughly $543 billion in non-defense discretionary appropriations went to unauthorized programs and activities. We're spending less on the authorized ones than we are on the unauthorized ones. We did not get there overnight. We have another chart using data compiled by the Congressional Budget Office showing that spending on unauthorized appropriations has been increasing over the course of the last 3 decades. It's a rising tide of unauthorized appropriations. It's also worth noting that most of the current $310 billion in unauthorized appropriations is funding programs whose authorization has been expired for a decade or more. In fact, we continue to fund some programs whose authorization expired more than 30 years ago. That means we fund these initiatives whether they're accomplishing their goals or not. Appropriations have become increasingly divorced from authorizations, despite the presence of rule regimes in place in both chambers of Congress intended to prevent unauthorized appropriations. Senate Rule 16 and House Rule 21 create points of order against unauthorized appropriations. But these rules are not comprehensive, they're not self-enforcing, and they are rarely used in actual practice. Consequently, the reauthorization of discretionary funded programs is itself becoming discretionary, with the appropriations process increasingly blind to the authorization status of the various line items being funded. Instead of a bilateral system of authorization and appropriation, with program funding contingent on both, we're moving toward a unilateral system. Again, I doubt it's coincidental that duplicative programs are proliferating along with the unauthorized appropriations. We are now funding 158 STEM education programs and nearly 700 renewable energy initiatives, according to the Government Accountability Office. To be clear, I'm not arguing that every program whose authorization has expired does not merit funding, but if appropriations are in no way contingent on authorization, we relinquish our responsibility to regularly review and reform programs. It's not enough for authorizing committees to act only to avert crises. That essentially sets discretionary spending on the same autopilot mode to which we have already set 2/3 of the budget that consists of entitlements and other mandatory spending. Ultimately, if we're going to cure our chronic overspending habit, we need to fix America's broken budget process, especially between the congressional authorization and the appropriation process. I should mention that these expired expenditures are only where they listed a specific expenditure, not such sums or other things. We have programs that would run that total up considerably if all of those programs were thrown in. I hope we can find a solution today. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Hall, for appearing before us today. I was looking forward to hearing your testimony last month on CBO's revised budget outlook, but the blizzard superseded that hearing, so I'll make the most of your participation today by focusing a little on CBO's projections in my opening remarks. But first, there's another matter that I'd like to address. Director Hall is entitled to the benefit of the doubt, and he will have it. But a caution light blinks for many of us based on his background at the Mercatus Center, which the Washington Post described as a, quote, staunchly anti-regulatory center funded largely by Koch Industries Incorporated. In her recent book, Dark Money, journalist Jane Mayer wrote that Clayton Coppin, a professor at George Mason who reviewed Bill Koch's political activities, concluded Mercatus to be, quote, a lobbying group disguised as a disinterested academic program, close quote. This caution acquires particular force for some of us because of the novelty of dynamic scoring and the discretion that CBO has been given in this area. Dynamic scoring can be used selectively, for instance, to ease the passage of legislation like large corporate tax cuts, while ignoring growth or savings that come from investments on the spending side. CBO has a long-standing reputation for independence and provides a critical function to Congress. It is important that that not be compromised. I will say no more, and I'm sure Director Hall understands. I now want to turn to the budget outlook. As was widely reported last month, CBO projects the budget deficit will grow in 2016 for the first time since 2009. In describing a $130 billion jump in its 2016 deficit calculation, CBO noted, that increase is largely attributable to legislation enacted since August. In particular, the retroactive extension of a number of provisions that reduce corporate and individual income taxes. While I supported the omnibus bill, I believe the tax provisions, which cost over $800 billion over 10 years, including interest costs, should have been paid for like any other spending increases. It is somewhat astonishing that Republicans insisted on offsetting the costs of $80 billion in sequester relief, but supported $800 billion in tax spending with no offsets. Tax spending is real spending. As former Speaker John Boehner said, we need to acknowledge that what Washington sometimes calls tax cuts are really just poorly disguised spending programs that expand the role of government in the lives of individuals and employers. Reagan economist Martin Feldstein agrees and noted, cutting tax expenditures is really the best way to reduce government spending. I would add that tax spending is also a vector for big giveaways to special interests. In the budget outlook, CBO projects revenue as a share of GDP will hover around 18% for the next decade. The last time we had budget surpluses, at the end of the Clinton administration, revenue hit 20% of GDP. If we truly believe the deficit threatens future prosperity and are truly serious about wanting to tackle it, we are going to need to acknowledge that tax spending is part of the problem. Much of that tax spending is an Alibaba's cave of treasure for special interests. And unlike one-time appropriations earmarks, special interest tax spending lives on and on and on in Alibaba's cave. These, too, are permanent authorizations. So far, Republicans have been unwilling to give up a single tax loophole in the cause of deficit reduction, not a one. The supercommittee charged with replacing the harmful sequester cuts failed, in large part because Republicans refused to close any tax loopholes. Each time we've negotiated sequester relief, Democrats try to bring loopholes into the mix, and each time it is refused. As the Senate passed FY 2016 budget resolution noted, tax expenditures for 2016 will total about $1.5 trillion. By 2025, tax expenditures will rise to over $2.2 trillion. We will spend more money on tax expenditures this year than we will spend on all federal health care programs combined. We will spend, for instance, $60 billion this year on the, shall we say, much discussed Obamacare insurance exchange subsidies, but 25 times that amount will go out the back door of the tax code. From the carried interest loophole for hedge fund managers to tax code subsidies for oil and gas giants, there is plenty of deficit reduction to be found in tax provisions designed to take care of wealthy and well-connected interests. Any sincere effort to cut the deficit must end egregious tax giveaways. Turning to the topic of today's hearing, unauthorized spending is a symptom of broader dysfunction in the budget process. When you look at how difficult it can be to reauthorize even popular programs like the Violence Against Women Act, it's no surprise the Senate can't keep up and that authorizations lapse. Given institutional hurdles and partisan obstruction, we should consider whether it makes sense to have authorizations sunset or whether they should continue until repealed or replaced. Finally, as we continue to examine process reforms, Budget Committee members need to have a frank discussion about the relevance of this committee. In a Senate that requires 60 votes on any major legislation, the 60-vote penalty for violating this committee's budget is meaningless, both to the Appropriations Committee and to the body. And I think the negligible attendance that we see at Budget Committee proceedings is not a signal of the fact that we're up on the 6th floor, but a signal of the fact that everybody recognizes we really don't count for much any longer. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your leadership in exploring ways to improve the budget process and to revive the relevance of what should be an important committee. As you contemplate a new budget resolution and budget process reforms, I encourage you to continue the spirit of open dialogue and of fostering bipartisan ideas, and I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. We know that the authorization process has been for many decades a key facilitator of programmatic oversight and reform. When we fund unauthorized programs, we keep the experts who sit on the committees of the authorization on the sidelines. We put too much of a burden on the shoulders of appropriators. We skip the budget. We become the sole arbiters of funding decisions often made under great duress after a fiscal year has already begun because the work didn't get done timely. Congress should not abandon its fundamental responsibility to authorize and reauthorize what it funds, and I look forward to working with you on doing something about the budget process, too. Our first witness today is Keith Hall, who's the Director of the Congressional Budget Office. Some of the data I cited in my opening statement comes from the most recent version of CBO's annual report called Unauthorized Appropriations and Expiring Authorizations. CBO is required to issue this report each year under the terms of the Congressional Budget Act. Dr. Hall is the 9th CBO Director. He's an economist who formerly served as Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Chief Economist of the White House Council of Economic Advisors and the Department of Commerce, and a Senior International Economist for the International Trade Commission. Dr. Hall, thank you for joining us today to inform our discussion on these unauthorized appropriations. Dr. Hall.
Chairman Enzi, Senator Whitehouse, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about unauthorized appropriations. Since this is a technical subject, I will start with some background to make it clear to everyone what I'll be talking about. Legislative practice has long differentiated the laws that establish federal entities or programs from laws that fund them. Authorizing legislation is the first component of that practice, and appropriation laws are the second. Specifically, once the authorizations for the agencies, programs, or activities are in place, annual appropriation laws separately provide funding for them. Authorizing legislation can take different forms. It can be organic or enabling legislation, which broadly authorizes the creation and operation of an agency, program, or activity. Such legislation may or may not include an authorization of appropriations, which explicitly authorizes the funding for the agency, program, or activity. Authorizations of appropriations can specify the amounts that may be appropriated for certain fiscal years or for an unspecified period. They can also indicate that the amounts are indefinite, authorizing the appropriation of such sums as may be necessary. If an authorization indicates either specific or indefinite amounts, I'll refer to it as an explicit authorization. Such authorizations are intended to offer guidance regarding the amount of funds necessary to carry out the authorized activities of an agency. Even when an explicit authorization of appropriations has expired, the organic legislation usually remains in place. With that background, I'll now discuss CBO's analysis of unauthorized appropriations. Each year, we provide the Congress with a report titled Unauthorized Appropriations and Expiring Authorizations, as mandated by the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Last month, we published the most recent one, known as the UAEA report, covering fiscal year 2016. Our UAEA report seeks to identify programs whose explicit authorization of appropriations has expired. For 2016, we reported that a total of $310 billion, about 1/4 of discretionary appropriations in that year, was provided for programs and activities whose explicit authorization of appropriations had expired and whose appropriations could be identified. More than half of those unauthorized appropriations were provided for programs whose explicit authorization expired more than a decade ago. I want to make 4 points about the UAEA reports. First, the law requires CBO to prepare an annual report that identifies all programs and activities funded during a fiscal year for which authorizations of appropriations have not been enacted for that year. Our report includes only those programs whose explicit authorization of appropriations has expired. CBO cannot identify programs or activities that are receiving an appropriation even though they have never had an explicit authorization of appropriations. Our report sometimes identifies a program whose explicit authorization of appropriations has expired, but not the amount appropriated because the program's funding is part of a larger appropriation account. Quite a few of those amounts are probably small, and some may be part of appropriations listed elsewhere in the report. And finally, even if the authorization of appropriations has expired, our report does not identify whether the organic or enabling statute governing a program or activity has expired. A permanent law may continue to set the policies and guidelines under which such appropriations are to be obligated. Identifying cases where enabling statutes never existed or have expired is not the focus of the law's requirement. To identify such cases among all programs and activities of the federal government would be virtually impossible. To give a concrete sense of what's behind the numbers in our report, here are some examples. When we issued our latest report, the authorization of appropriations for several large agencies or programs had expired. This includes the National Institute of Health, with appropriations of $31 billion for 2016, NASA, with appropriations of $19 billion for 2016. Even though the authorizations of appropriations for these programs have expired, organic legislation permanently authorizes the activities of those agencies. Those laws were most recently modified in 2007 for NIH and 2010 for NASA. Some other large appropriations with expired authorizations of appropriations include the following: $27 billion for programs authorized in the Violence Against Women and Department of Justice Reauthorization Act of 2005, $26 billion for programs authorized in the Foreign Relations Authorization Act, fiscal year 2003, and $26 billion for programs authorized in the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act of 1998. Expiration of authorizations for particular large agencies or large programs can significantly affect the changes from one year to the next in our report. For example, CBO reported that the total amount of unauthorized appropriations in 2008 was $167 billion, but it has been noticeably larger since then, averaging close to $300 billion. That increase was attributable in part to the expiration of the 2009 authorizations of appropriations for both NIH and the programs in the Department of Justice that I just mentioned. On average, over the past decade, about 1/4 of total discretionary appropriations were provided for programs and activities whose explicit authorizations of appropriations had expired. I hope that you find this information helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you again.
Thank you. I really appreciate the detail that you went to in this report. I think it'll be very helpful, but one of the difficulties that we have around here is ever going back to look at anything we did in the past. We pointed that out with one hearing on old regulations, and these are old laws that we don't go back and revisit to see what changes need to be done. But I do appreciate the work that you and your staff did in this area. I think the findings are very illuminating. I do want to highlight that the report only hints at the extent to which we're losing control over the annual spending. As you pointed out, besides the $310 billion, there are funds and activities that never received any explicit authorization. Now, when Senator Coburn was here, I don't think he let any bills go through that didn't have an explicit one in there, so he'd know how much was anticipated to be spent on that item. So a lot of them that are not expired, that have specific sums in them, are the result of the work that he did. He really did not like the word "such sums" or funded at levels above authorized limits. Is there a better way to measure the degree to which the annual appropriations are unchecked by the authorization process?
Well, you're right that one of the problems is that we haven't been able to look at programs that have no organic or enabling authority to exist at all. And getting a comprehensive list of those is very difficult. For example, trying to establish the linkages between appropriation accounts and authorizing statutes for everything, it would take really quite a long time. We certainly could work with you some to try to improve this report and maybe try to include more of that. I think something like a census is very difficult. If you sort of think about it, if we take every program that has an appropriation, in a sense we're trying to prove a negative. We're trying to establish that there's no authorizing language. So we have to go through all the laws to try to establish that nothing exists. And then to do that for every appropriation. So the perfect is probably impossible, but we certainly could do more to make this a better report.
Well, another thing we discovered through the process is it was 260 expired authorizations, but I think it was over 1,200 programs, because each authorization, again, to expedite being able to get through the whole process, I think we combine them a lot. And that also allows us to hide some of the things. I'm always looking for suggestions on how we can get Congress to go back and take a look at what we've done before. And we talk about such big numbers around here that I used to be a mayor, and on the city council I know it took us longer to approve a shovel than it did street construction. And that's because everybody understood what a shovel was and how there are several different kinds of shovel, but they didn't know much about street construction. So the street construction went right through and the shovel took a long time. I suspect that's one of the problems with some of these things. Now, your report inventories programs and activities that are explicitly authorized to receive annual appropriations for duration of time. The time periods lapsed, yet the funds continue to flow. As a student of the political economy, do you find it troubling that the majority of federal programs, the government's non-defense discretionary spending fund programs and activities with lapsed authorizations? Should we just approve programs and let appropes decide all the priorities? Any suggestions?
Well, I have to say, as a citizen, I think the country would be well served if the government activities of all kinds, discretionary spending, mandatory programs, and provisions of the tax code were reviewed from time to time to make sure that they're being implemented effectively and to determine whether changes are necessary. And I think going through a regular process of reauthorizing discretionary programs would certainly be one component of such a process, a useful component.
Thank you. We are going to be looking at the process a lot more this year, as Senator Whitehouse suggested, and as we've held some other hearings. I'll yield back the balance of my time. Since Senator Whitehouse isn't here, I'll go to Senator Perdue.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me.
No, go ahead.
Senator.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
No, please, go ahead. I'll yield to the ranking member.
Well, that's kind of you. I'd like to go back to the point that I ended my remarks with about trying to sort of revive the relevance of the committee, and that as a larger issue around it, which is reviving the transparency of our spending. When we are in crisis mode and our budgets are being worked out between the Speaker, the Majority Leader, and the President, then there's zero transparency into that. And I know from my perspective as a still somewhat junior senator that trying to get the things you want to have a hearing in that conversation is virtually impossible. It's about as untransparent as you can, and things come in basically based on favoritism, clout, influence. I mean, it's kind of the worst of all possible worlds that we create for ourselves when there isn't a proper process and there's just a crisis negotiation at the end. Second best behind that is having the appropriations committees work through all their stuff and then have no proper floor work on what the appropriators propose to us, so that that gets jammed down the rest of the body's throat, which is great for the appropriators, but not so great for the body. And we've basically been gravitating back and forth between those two models virtually for as long as I have been here in the Senate. So, and throughout all of that, the Budget Committee has been utterly sidelined because every appropriator knows that they're going to have to put a deal together that gets 60 votes. They can't go forward until they have 60 votes. And once they know they have 60 votes, they know that there's nothing, it doesn't matter about our budget resolution. And then everybody else knows that as well. So when we do our budget resolution work, this room is empty, but for the staff of the people who are condemned to be here and go through the exercise. And that's, I think, a pretty important signal that nothing important is happening here when nobody shows up for it in a town that is immensely curious about the exercise of spending and power and so forth. So I think that Chairman Enzi has done a really commendable service to this committee by trying to open our aperture to focus on what our role is and how we can redefine ourselves. But whether it's entirely overlooking tax spending, having no transparent authorization or very little transparent authorization process that is meaningful to the appropriators, and having appropriation run on cruise control even where there are no authorizations, it's really been a very dramatic collapse of the appropriating and funding function of this body into a very small group of people. And particularly at the crisis period, there is zero transparency. And as somebody, I'll close with where I started. As somebody who has to try to fight to get attention for programs into that process, and it's all, you know, you're calling people on the phone saying, can I get this in, can I get this in? And nobody knows what my motivations are, nobody knows what the other side of the argument is. I mean, the process completely stinks once it's in crisis mode. And so I hope that you, Mr. Hall, can help lead us along with the chairman, and I think there's going to be a lot of support for it on our side to have a conversation about how we can use this committee to facilitate a broader and more transparent process for funding this enormous enterprise of the United States government, both on the spending side and on the tax spending side.
Well, we're certainly happy to help in any way we can, and we're perfectly willing, and we're...
Do you concur generally with the points that I made about the lack of transparency and the lack of effect of, the lack of transparency in the spending side and the lack of impact or import to our budgeting effort?
Well, we constantly have some issues where we're in our work, where we're trying to be helpful and offer advice to committees in a confidential way. But then when things become public, a bill or a proposal becomes public, we have a very important transparency practice where we try to create a level playing field and make our estimates public.
Yeah.
And we send them to both sides, and I'm hopefully
I think
that
at this
helps.
point, your most valuable function, given the general lack of impact that this committee has or import of this committee, is that information providing function. And I think the transparency of that information and the reliability of CBO information has a very healthy effect throughout our process. But once you get past information into actually doing something, that's where I think it's down to either the four guys in the room during the crisis or the appropriators, and particularly the cardinals, in their appropriations process for an omnibus.
Well, we'll certainly keep trying to do our best to create transparency in what we do and help further if you like.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Senator Grassley was here at the sound of the gavel, so we'll go to him, and then Senator Perdue, and then Senator Ayotte.
First, before I ask questions, let me confess, as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I see on a list of committees that we're fifth or sixth with about $30 billion of that figure of unauthorized. And as Senator Whitehouse and I have worked so hard on reauthorizing the Juvenile Justice Reform Act and getting that done in our committee about 6 months ago and still don't have it through the Senate, it just seems like it's going to take a long time to get work done that ought to be done. But with that caveat, it seems to me that appropriators are really the only committee spending time reevaluating lots of these programs. So my question to you, do appropriators evaluate programs at a level equivalent to what an authorizing committee should do if the authorizing committee did its job?
Well, for me personally, I don't have enough experience to answer that. One of the things that we hope is that our report is a good starting point. You know, it's imperfect, but it's a good starting point if you want to start looking at this issue of sort of matching authorizations and appropriations.
Yeah. Another question, is there an argument here for biannual budgeting so that more time can be spent on oversight and reauthorization efforts?
Well, I hesitate to offer advice on something like that. We certainly would be happy to accommodate whatever type of budgeting that you decide.
Let me go to a rhetorical question. Okay. If I'm asking you questions that you can't give advice on, our country is $19 trillion in debt. The 2016 deficit is projected to increase that by $544 billion. What message are we sending to the American people that with this dire financial situation, we can't find the time to evaluate and scrutinize existing programs? If Congress doesn't do the necessary oversight that reauthorization requires, how can anyone trust that valuable fiscal resource that they are being used for the highest priorities? You surely can speak to that point.
Well, sure, and this is where we hope our annual budget forecast is useful, because the exercise of looking at what the budget's going to look like, say, over the next 10 years under current law, and what sort of deficits that we're going to have, I think is a useful thing. It's a useful thing to remind people that this is an issue, and something that CBO has said for a long time is that this is on a trend that's not sustainable. At some point, the debt's going to get to a level where there are going to be real problems. It may not happen soon, but it's going to happen at some point unless there's some change.
Yeah. Since you studied this issue that comes up with the $310 billion figure of programs unauthorized, and you have to look at the entire federal budget programs of $3 6/10 trillion, I guess. Would you categorize the $310 billion as essentially low-hanging fruit that we ought to be able to deal with, or do you think it's more complicated than that?
Well, it's low-hanging fruit in the sense that we know about it. You know, one of the real difficulties here is this idea of trying to match the authorizations and the appropriations, because there's just so much law, and there's so many things in the federal budget. But these are things that hopefully this is useful to give you some idea of where there are issues, and you can deal with these. We may not be able to give you a real feel for the overall size of the problem, because this is not a comprehensive report, but it does give you a starting point, I think.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. Senator Perdue.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing, and Dr. Hall, thank you for being here again. You know that I've said this last time you were here. I'm a big fan of your work. Thank you for all you're doing to enlighten us about our crisis. But I disagree on the one thing. I'll come back to my point, and then I have a couple of questions. I don't think this is going to hit us soon. I think it's here right now. And the bellwether of that is what happened in December. Just a quarter-point increase in our Fed fund rate will indirectly lead to a potential increase in our federal interest of almost $50 billion. So the question I have is, you know, what happens if interest rates go back to our 50-year average of just 5%? We've all seen interest rates much higher than that, but we've lived in an arbitrarily flat interest world in the last 7 years. It's just not forecastable. We can't assume that going forward. So we know that interest rates are going up. We know that our interest expense is going up, and yet we sit in an environment where last year we saw our federal expenditures at $3.7 trillion, up from just in 2000 in constant dollars, it was $2.4 trillion. And you might say, well, we're spending more on military. Only $100 billion of that increase was military. The rest of it is growth in mandatory expense. So we've got a situation today where it almost feels to me like, and God help me, I've been here a long time, I finally found something that Senator Whitehouse and I agree on, and I absolutely agree that the process is broken. The 74 Act has only worked 4 times in 40 years. It hasn't worked. It's not working. It will never work. And I feel like sometimes we're sitting around here talking about the layout of the chairs on the Titanic. There's no question we've got redundant agencies. There's no question we have agencies that have not been authorized. But the system of budgeting, authorization, and appropriation, by definition, was never going to work. It's not working, and so we've got to change that fundamental process. Having said that, we saw a report from the Controller General of the GAO recently talking about redundant agencies. Have you worked and can you work with the GAO to help us better understand the priorities and maybe the overlap between those unauthorized agencies and the redundant agencies that have been identified?
Sure, we're happy to contribute however we can.
Okay. Because I think, you know, the question is you know, how big of federal government do we need? Well, if we have redundant agencies, there's an opportunity. We talk about tax expenditures, but we raised $3.2 trillion last year in federal revenue. That's the largest ever. And I don't disagree that there are issues around deductions and so forth where we have corporate welfare issues and that sort of thing that are affecting our ability to deal with this. But honestly, until we get at this authorization process leading into an appropriation process that frankly is not working. It didn't work last year. It led into an omnibus just like it has in prior years that increases our spending. Your own report shows that we're adding some $8.5 trillion to the debt over the next decade, if I read the report correctly. What should we be doing in terms of prioritizing our approach? You do the measurement for us, but you also can model and look at things. Where's the low-hanging fruit in terms of going after this absolute crisis that we have today?
Well, sure. Well, one of the things we do, certainly in the Outlook, is we want to give you some idea of what the problem is, you know, so what trend we're on. It's certainly sort of not our role to sort of recommend things, but
right.
we did produce near the end of last year a number of budget options to give you some idea of the different things that you can do to improve the deficit situation, and some idea of what sort of impact it would have. So it's sort of a listing of things you can look at, tools that you have at your disposal. I think that's really worth looking at and getting a feel for what sort of options you have going forward.
Well, do you work with GAO at all to model some of their recommendations and ideas?
We do interact with GAO a bit. I don't know that we interact a lot on things.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I recommend, I mean, I absolutely applaud what you're doing here in terms of looking at this authorization issue. And I know that we're moving down a road that is really a bipartisan effort. I agree with Senator Whitehouse. I mean, this is not about partisan politics. This is about a crisis that's threatening our very ability to defend our nation. And it puts in jeopardy the very safety net programs that we all want. Social Security and Medicare, as we all know, absolutely their trust funds go to zero in 15 years. And yet we haven't, I've been here a year, we haven't had any salient conversations about how to save Social Security and Medicare. And those are the two things, as I look at your report, that are just exploding away from us in the next 10 years. And if you go out 10 more years, it really gets to the point of being unmanageable. I contend that it's already unmanageable. I look forward to further hearings like this and to actually move toward getting results. I'll just end with this. There are 4 words that I have not heard up here in 1 year that I used to hear every day in business, and that is, we can't afford it. We all do it in our personal homes. We do it in our personal lives. We teach our children to do it. And yet we run a federal government where we absolutely do not consider that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And our method of alternating, Senator Kane will be next.